Somewhere above you tonight, a machine longer than the first powered flight is drifting through the dark at nearly the speed of sound, and everyone inside it is asleep. You've seen this shape 1,000 times, that strange bulge riding high on the nose like a cathedral dome, and perhaps you've never wondered why it's there at all. The answer isn't beauty. It's a bet made in the late 1960s by a handful of quietly terrified engineers who were asked to build something so vast that no one could quite picture it, and who very nearly lost everything doing it. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and let the hum of four great engines carry you somewhere soft. Because before the Queen of the Skies ever touched a runway, she existed only as a curve sketched on paper at midnight, a company's entire future resting on lines that hadn't yet proven they could fly. Picture a silver hull, high and quiet, drifting above a floor of soft white cloud. There is no sound up here that you would call noise, just a low, steady breath of air moving over aluminum. A hush so even that it becomes something closer to silence than to sound. The wings flex gently with the air, the way a swimmer's arms move through deep water, and far below, the world goes about its business without ever looking up. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Take one slow breath in, hold it for a moment, and let it out, longer than you took it in. That great silver shape is going to carry us through this entire story, and it is in no hurry at all. Neither are we. Everything that follows happened in the past, which means the ending is already safe. Nothing more to fly. It needs one crew, not three. It occupies one landing slot, not three. Its fuel burn per seat can be lower because a bigger wing and bigger engines can be made more efficient than smaller ones. Stretch the arithmetic far enough, and you arrive somewhere remarkable. You arrive at the possibility that ordinary people, not just executives and diplomats and film stars, might someday be able to afford to cross an ocean. Nobody in 1965 knew which answer would win. And in the strange way that history sometimes works, the machine that ended up shaping the next 50 years of aviation was designed by people who assumed, more or less, that they were building the loser. That is not an exaggeration. The engineers who drew the 747 largely believed that supersonic airliners would take over the premium passenger business within a decade or so, and that their enormous subsonic creation would then spend its long retirement hauling freight. They designed it with that fate in mind, which is why, as you will see, the airplane has a hump on its back and a nose that can open like a mouth. The most beloved passenger aircraft in history carries the fingerprints of a cargo plane that its own creators expected it to become. Now, before the airliner, there was a competition, and it was for the military. In the early 1960s, the United States Air Force wanted an enormous strategic transport, a machine that could swallow tanks and helicopters and thousands of troops and fly them across the world without refueling. The requirement went by an unlovely string of letters, and it asked for something far larger than anything than flying. Boeing entered a design, so did Douglas, so did Lockheed, and in 1965 the Air Force chose Lockheed, whose entry became the C-5 Galaxy. Boeing lost. Thousands of hours of engineering work, wind tunnel time, and drawings for a gigantic freighter went into a filing cabinet, and the men who had drawn it went back to their other projects, presumably grumbling. But something priceless survived that defeat, and it had nothing to do with airframes. To lift a machine that size, the engine makers had been pushed into an entirely new generation of turbine. Until then, jetliners used turbojets, which produce thrust by shoving a relatively small amount of air through the engine core at tremendous speed. Loud, thirsty, and limited. The new idea was the high bypass turbofan, in which a very large fan at the front of the engine pushes an enormous volume of air around the hot core rather than through it. Most of your thrust now comes from that cool, slow, massive column of bypass air. Think of the difference between a thin jet from a garden hose nozzle and a wide, gentle push from a paddle. The paddle moves far more water with far less violence. That is the whole secret. More air, moved more gently, gives you more thrust for less fuel, and it does it much more quietly. So the losing bid left behind a gift. The engines that had been dreamed up for a giant military freighter could now be pointed at something else entirely. And into this moment walked a man who had been circling the same idea from a completely different direction. A man who did not build airplanes at all, but who had spent his entire career telling the people who did build them what he wanted next. His name was Juan Trippe, and he ran Pan American World Airways. Trippe was a curious figure, patrician and secretive and relentless, and for 4 decades he had made a habit of ordering airplanes that did not exist yet. He had done it with flying boats in the 1930s, sending Pan Am's clippers across the Pacific in hops from island to island, when the very idea of scheduled ocean flight was closer to stunt than to business. He had done it with the jet age itself, placing an order for Boeing 707s in 1955 that effectively dragged the American industry across the threshold into jet travel. Trippe understood something that many airline men did not. If you commit money early enough and publicly enough, you do not merely buy an airplane. You cause it to exist, and then you get it before your competitors do. By the middle of the 1960s, Tripp was watching his own aircraft fill up and his own terminals overflow, and he had arrived at a conclusion that made his engineers wince. He wanted an airplane roughly 2.5 times the size of a 707, not 20% bigger, not 50% bigger, 2.5 times, something that could carry 400 passengers or more across an ocean in a single flight. Every polite objection you can imagine was raised. There is a story, repeated so often it has taken on the polish of legend, of Tripp and Boeing's president, William Allen, on a fishing trip in Alaska, talking around the subject the way men do when the real conversation is too large to approach directly, until finally one of them said, in effect, "If you build it, I will buy it." And the other answered, "If you buy it, I will build it." Whether the words were exactly those hardly matters. The handshake was real enough. The formal moment came in April of 1966. Pan Am signed for 25 aircraft that existed only as sketches and studies at a price of about $525 million. Adjust that for the passage of time and it becomes an eye-watering sum. And remember that Tripp was buying something nobody had built, nobody had flown, and nobody had certified. There was no prototype. There was no factory. There was at that point not even a settled shape. What there was a promise, a deposit, and a delivery date that Tripp insisted must fall in 1969, which gave Boeing something close to 28 months to invent an airplane larger than any in the world and put it into airline service. Sit with that number for a moment, because it is one of the quietly astonishing facts of this whole story. 28 months. Today, a clean sheet airliner takes the better part of a decade from concept to first delivery, with computers doing the calculating, with digital models catching interferences before a single part is cut, with software simulating flutter and airflow and stress in ways that would have looked like sorcery in 1966. Boeing had none of it. Boeing had pencils, drafting tables, slide rules, and rooms full of people. And Boeing had a deadline written into a contract with the most demanding customer in the industry. The man who inherited that deadline was Joe Sutter. He was in his mid-40s, a Seattle native who had grown up in a house on Beacon Hill, overlooking the Boeing plant, watching airplanes take shape below him. He had served in the Navy, studied aeronautical engineering, and spent his career inside Boeing working on the 707 and the 727 and the 737, which is to say he had already helped shape the airplanes that carried the jet age into being. Sutter did not want the 747 job. He was deep in work on the 737 at the time, and the big airplane looked like a distraction attached to a customer with impossible expectations. But management wanted him on it, and so he took it, and in doing so he became the person history would eventually call the father of the 747, a title he wore with a mixture of pride and mild embarrassment for the rest of his long life. His team was small at first, and then it was not. It grew and grew until at its peak something like 4,500 engineers were working on this single airplane, and they were spread across borrowed offices and leased buildings all over the Seattle area because there was nowhere large enough to put them together. They came to be called the Incredibles, another nickname that stuck, and the number that always gets quoted alongside them is 50,000, the rough count of engineers, mechanics, machinists, planners, and support staff who eventually one option and became the only sensible one. But there was still the freighter to think about, and that is where the hump comes from. If your airplane is going to spend its later life carrying cargo, the most efficient way to load it is straight in through the front, so that long items can slide the full length of the hold on rollers. That means the entire nose has to swing upward on hinges, which means there can be nothing in the nose that needs to stay put, and the cockpit needs to stay put. So the flight deck was lifted, placed above the main cabin, tucked into a fairing that blended smoothly back into the fuselage roof so as not to spoil the airflow. That fairing left a small enclosed space behind the pilots, and rather than waste it, the designers turned it into a lounge reached by that spiral staircase, which means the 747's most famous feature, the elegant curve of its brow, the silhouette you can recognize from a mile away at dusk, exists because somebody wanted a door in the front for boxes. Isn't that a lovely thing to know as you settle deeper into your pillow? The signature of the most graceful airliner ever built is a solution to a cargo handling problem, beauty arriving sideways, as it so often does. Then there were the engines, and here is where the numbers begin to feel dreamlike. An airplane of this size would need to lift something in the neighborhood of 750,000 pounds off a runway, and to do that with 4 engines meant each engine had to produce more than 40,000 pounds of thrust. The engines on the 707 produced roughly 18,000. So the requirement was to more than double the most powerful commercial engine in the world, and to do it inside the same 28-month window. Pratt & Whitney took the job with a high bypass turbofan called the JT9D, an engine with a fan at the front nearly 8 feet across, a bypass ratio of around 5-to-1, meaning 5 times as much air went around the core as through it. Standing in front of one, you could look into a circular opening large enough to hold a small car. Every airplane engine is a compromise between violence and patience, and the high bypass fan tilts the balance decisively toward patience. Because it moves so much air so gently, it is far quieter than a turbojet. People who lived near airports in the 1960s knew the difference immediately, because the earlier jets tore the air apart with a shriek that rattled windows for miles. The new fans made a sound more like a rush, a deep and rounded roar with a whistle threaded through it. If you have ever stood at the end of a runway and felt a 747 pass overhead, you know the noise is not sharp. It is enormous, but it is soft-edged, a wave rather than a blade. That quality came directly out of the geometry of moving a great deal of air slowly. The engines were the hardest part, and they nearly broke the program. Doubling thrust in 3 years is not the kind of thing that goes smoothly. Early JT9Ds suffered from a problem where the casing distorted slightly under load, letting the blade tips rub or the gas path leak, which cost efficiency and, in the worst cases, wrecked the engine. There were surges and stalls. There were engines that had to be pulled and rebuilt. At one point during flight testing, aircraft sat on the ground at Everett with concrete blocks hanging where their engines should have been, because Pratt & Whitney simply could not deliver them fast enough. But that comes a little later in our story. For now, in 1966, the engine was still a promise on paper, and everything else had to be designed around a promise. The wing was its own universe of problems. A wing for an airplane this heavy would have to be gigantic, something on the order of 5,500 square feet of area, swept back about 37.5 degrees so that the airflow over it stayed civilized at high cruise speeds. But a wing large enough and clean enough to cruise efficiently near the speed of sound is a terrible wing for landing, because it wants to keep flying at speeds far too high for any runway. So the wing had to transform. Along its trailing edge went triple-slotted flaps, panels that slid rearward and hinged downward and separated into three overlapping segments, opening gaps that let high-energy air flow through and keep clinging to the curve. Along the leading edge went a set of flaps that extended and folded out to reshape the very front of the airfoil. When it was all deployed for landing, the wing effectively grew, curved, and softened, and the airplane could settle onto a runway at a speed a light aircraft pilot would find only mildly brisk, and all of that had to be light. That is the thing people forget about airplanes. Every solution has to be argued against a scale. On a machine this size, a single pound saved in a part that appears in 100 places is 100 pounds of payload gained for the airplane's whole life. Sutter's engineers hunted grams with a kind of religious devotion. They also had to fight a different battle entirely, which is that the airplane's projected weight kept creeping up as reality intruded, and every extra pound demanded more thrust, more fuel, more structure to carry the fuel, more weight to carry the structure. Aircraft designers call this the weight spiral, and it has killed more programs than bad luck ever has. Keeping the 747 out of that spiral in the middle of a sprint was, in its own way, as impressive as anything else they did. Down at the bottom of the airplane, another quiet problem waited. Something weighing 750,000 pounds has to stand on pavement, and pavement is not as strong as you might think. Concentrate that much weight on too few wheels, and the airplane will punch into the surface, ruining taxiways all over the world and making itself unwelcome at every airport. So the landing gear was multiplied. 4 main gear assemblies, arranged in a rectangle beneath the fuselage and wings, each with 4 wheels, 16 wheels in total, plus 2 more on the nose, 18 tires spreading the load, and a geometry clever enough that the airplane could still turn on a normal taxiway without dragging its own feet sideways. The rear main gear were even given the ability to steer slightly, so the whole assembly could follow a curve rather than fight it. While all of this was being drawn, a second impossible project was underway, and honestly it deserves a story of its own. Boeing had nowhere to build this airplane. Every existing plant was too small, with ceilings too low and doors too narrow and floors already crowded, so the company went looking for land and settled on a site near Payne Field at Everett, north of Seattle, on a plateau of somewhere around 780 acres of forest and hillside. Then it began to build the largest building in the world by volume, and it did this in the wet Pacific Northwest winter, on ground that had to be cleared of stumps and regraded and drained, while designers were still deciding how big the airplane inside would be. The images from that period have a wonderful, faintly absurd quality. Mud everywhere, trucks sunk to their axles, steel columns rising out of a churned field, workers pouring floor in one bay while another bay was still open to the rain. There is a much repeated detail that the site had been a forest and that some of the timber cut down to clear it was used in the construction. And there is another detail I find quietly moving, which is that as soon as any portion of the building was enclosed and floored, tooling was moved in and work began, so that the factory was manufacturing an airplane at one end while it was still being erected at the other. A rail spur had to be laid up a grade to reach the plateau. Roads had to be widened. A small town's worth of parking had to appear. The man who drove much of that effort was Malcolm Stamper, brought in to run the program with an engineer's mind and an organizer's stubbornness, and his job for 2 years was essentially to make impossible schedules collide gently. outside, but the numbers underneath were anything but small. Developing the 747 and building the factory to hold it cost Boeing something on the order of $1 billion in the money of that era, and the company's entire net worth was considerably less than that. To finance it, Boeing borrowed on a scale that made its bankers nervous, at interest rates that climbed as the decade turned. If the airplane had failed, the company would have failed with it. There is a reason the phrase most often attached to this program is that Boeing bet the company. It is not a figure of speech. It is a description of the balance sheet. And what makes it more remarkable is that the bet was placed on a machine that its makers thought would be superseded in the passenger role within a decade. Read that again, slowly, because it is the strangest fact in the whole story. Boeing committed everything it had to an airliner it expected to become a freighter in order to serve a customer who wanted it immediately, while simultaneously working on the supersonic airliner that was supposed to make it obsolete. The company was, in effect, betting against itself in two directions at once, and in the end the supersonic program was cancelled, and the airplane everyone thought was a stopgap flew for more than 50 years. History has a sense of humor, though it delivers the punchline slowly. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the temperament required to sign a contract in April of 1966 for delivery in 1969, when you have no factory, no engine, no wing, and no settled fuselage. You must possess a very particular kind of steadiness, not recklessness. Recklessness makes noise. This was quieter than that. It was the steadiness of people who had done hard things before and had learned to trust the process of doing them. William Allen, the lawyer who ran Boeing, had already gambled the company once in the early 1950s when he authorized a prototype jet transport out of Boeing's own funds with no orders in hand, and that gamble produced the 707 and the American jet age. Tripp had gambled repeatedly across 4 decades. Sutter had spent his career shipping airplanes that worked. When these men leapt, they leapt with their eyes open, which is a very different thing from leaping in the dark. Think of it as the way an experienced climber moves on rock. To someone watching from below, the climber looks fearless, hanging out over emptiness with nothing but fingertips. But the climber is not ignoring the drop. The climber has simply narrowed the world down to the next hold and the next and the next, trusting that 1,000 small correct decisions will add up to standing on top. That was the 747 program. Nobody in 1966 could hold the whole thing in their head. It was too big. So they held the next piece, and the piece after that, and they trusted the arithmetic, and the airplane assembled itself out of their patience. By the summer of 1968, the first aircraft was standing inside the new building at Everett, surrounded by scaffolding, missing pieces, crawling with people. On the last day of September that year, it was rolled out into the daylight for the first time in front of a crowd of thousands, with the flight attendants of the 26 airlines that had ordered it standing beneath the nose in their uniforms. And everyone who saw it said some version of the same thing, which was that photographs had not prepared them. The tail rose 6 stories. The wingspan reached nearly 200 feet. The engines hung beneath the wings like enormous barrels. It did not look like a bigger airliner. It looked like a different category of object. And on a cold, gusty morning in February of 1969, a test pilot named Jack Waddell sat in a flight deck 3 stories above the ground, ran those 4 new engines up, and took the first 747 into the air over Washington State. The flight was cut short by a minor problem with one of the flap sections, and it lasted a little over an hour. And when Waddell came down, he said the thing that everyone in the program had been quietly hoping to hear. It handled beautifully. It was, in his words and the words of the pilots who followed him, a pilot's airplane, light on the controls, honest, responsive, easier to fly than anything that size had any right to be. The pencils and the slide rules and the wind tunnels and the mud at Everett had all added up. But we will come to the flying and the trouble with the engines and the long, strange winter when Boeing very nearly did not survive its own triumph. All of that is ahead of us, and it can wait. For now, let the picture stay simple. A silver hull, high above a soft floor of cloud, moving with the unhurried confidence of something that was drawn by hand under a lamp by people who did not know for certain that it would work. A hump on its back because somebody wanted a door for boxes. A room instead of a tube inside because somebody insisted that people should be able to breathe. 4 gentle giants under the wings, pushing a river of cool air rearward, holding 400 sleeping travelers in the thin blue air 5 miles up. There is something restful in that, I think. Not just the sound of the airplane, but the shape of the story. Somebody imagined a machine that seemed absurd. Somebody else decided to pay for it before it existed. And a few thousand people working with paper and patience spent 2 years turning an absurdity into something so ordinary that within a generation nobody would even glance up when one passed overhead. The world is full of things like this, quietly enormous, built by hand, taken for granted. The Queen of the Skies just happens to be the most magnificent of them. So let the shoulders go soft again. Let the breath slow. The hull is still up there in our imagination, drifting, holding its altitude, the sunlight sliding along its flank as the clouds move underneath. The gamble has already paid off. The airplane already flew. Everything from here on is simply the story of how far it went, and we have all the time in the world to tell it. Somewhere in the summer of 1965 on the water off the coast of Alaska, 2 men in their 60s sat in a small boat with fishing rods in their hands, and between casts, they decided to build the largest airplane in the world. That is the whole story in one sentence, and like most single sentences about large things, it leaves out almost everything. But it is true, and there is something lovely about the smallness of it. No conference table, no microphones, no press release. Just cold green water, the smell of salt and diesel, the slap of a wake against the hull, and 2 quiet, formal, rather private men who had known each other for years and who trusted each other in the particular way that people do when they have already made each other a great deal of money. One of them was William McPherson Allen, the president of the Boeing company, a Montana lawyer by training who had never wanted the job he had. He was not an engineer. He was not a salesman. He was a careful man with rimless glasses and a lawyer's instinct for reading a room. And when he had been asked in 1945 to take over Boeing, he had written down a list of reminders to himself about how to behave, things like being calm, being patient, listening more than he spoke, and not letting the pressure of the work turn him into someone unpleasant. He kept that habit for the rest of his career. He was the sort of leader who wrote himself notes about kindness and then went out and bet a company on an airplane. The other man was Juan Terry Trippi, who ran Pan American World Airways and who had spent nearly 40 years by then doing something very specific and very unusual. He did not simply buy airplanes. He decided what airplanes ought to exist, and then he leaned on the people who built them until they existed. He had done it with flying boats in the 1930s, when he wanted to cross oceans and no aircraft yet could. So he pushed Sikorsky and Martin and eventually Boeing into building bigger and bigger hulls until the Boeing 314 could carry passengers from New York to Europe over open water. He had done it again in 1955 when he placed an order for jets from 2 different manufacturers on the same day $250 million in one stroke, the largest commercial aircraft order anyone had ever placed, and in doing so, he shoved the entire industry into the jet age, whether it felt ready or not. And in between all of that, he had done something even stranger for a man in his position. He had spent years arguing against the wishes of nearly every other airline in the world that fares should come down, not slightly, dramatically. He believed that air travel would remain a small, expensive, faintly ceremonial business as long as it was priced for the wealthy, and that the real prize was not the 100,000 people who could already afford to fly, but the millions who could not. In the late 1940s, he began offering cheap seats on routes where he could get away with it, and in the early 1950s, he pushed the International Airline Association into permitting a lower class of transatlantic fare, and when other carriers resisted, he simply kept pushing. He was not being sentimental. He had done the arithmetic. Cheaper seats meant more passengers, and more passengers meant bigger airports. People in very quiet rooms working through what the yes actually meant, and this is the part one find genuinely moving because it is not dramatic at all. It is arithmetic. It is men with sharpened pencils looking at columns of numbers and gradually understanding that the columns did not balance and never would, not for years, and choosing to go forward anyway. Here is the shape of the problem. Boeing at that time was a large and successful company. It was building the 707 and the 720 and the 727, and it had just committed only months earlier to an entirely new small jet, the 737, which would go on to become the most produced airliner in history, but which in 1965 was simply one more program demanding money and engineers. Boeing also had a very substantial military and space business. By the standards of the day, its balance sheet was healthy, and yet when the planners added up what the new airplane would require, the figure they arrived at was roughly $1 billion in 1960s dollars before a single passenger had bought a single ticket. Sit with that number for a moment, because it does not mean much on its own. $1 billion is just a word. What matters is the comparison, and the comparison is this. The total value of the company, everything Boeing owned free and clear, all its plants and tooling and cash and inventory, was less than that. The airplane would cost more than the company was worth. They were not investing a portion of their capital. They were, in a very real accounting sense, spending themselves and then borrowing the difference on the assumption that a machine which did not exist, powered by engines which did not exist, built in a factory which did not exist, on ground that was at that point mostly trees and mud, would one day earn it all back. And the money was not the only exposure, there was the calendar. Tripp did not want the airplane eventually. He wanted it in service at the start of the 1970s, which meant the first one had to be handed over near the end of 1969, which meant Boeing had roughly 28 months from contract to delivery. For context, the modern industry, with computers and composite modeling and decades of accumulated wide-body experience, generally allows 5 or 6 years for a new airliner and often slips past that. Boeing had a little over 2 for an aircraft twice the size of anything that had flown as an airliner, and the drawings had to be done at the same time as the factory that would build it, and the engine had to be developed at the same time as the wing that would hang it. There was also the small matter of the guarantees. This was Juan Tripp's signature move, and he had used it on everyone. The contract did not merely say that Pan Am would take 25 aircraft for something on the order of $525 million. It specified what the aircraft would do, how many passengers, how far, how fast, on how much fuel. If the airplane came in heavy or thirsty or slow, Boeing paid. If the airplane came in late, Boeing paid. Tripp was buying performance, not sheet metal, and he wrote the promises down, which means that every engineering compromise the design team might later want to make, every pound they might have wanted to add, every knot they might have wanted to give away, had a price attached to it in advance, in a document signed in April of 1966. You would forgive the Boeing board for hesitating. Some of them did. The stories that survive from those meetings are not stories of triumphant fist-pounding. They are stories of directors asking careful, uncomfortable questions of the kind that boards exist to ask. What happens if the development costs run over? What happens if the airlines that have expressed interest do not actually order? What happens if the engines are late? And the answer that has come down to us, more or less as a piece of company folklore, is that when somebody asked what Boeing would do if the program's costs got seriously out of hand, the reply was that the possibility was too horrible to contemplate, not a reassurance, not a plan, just an honest acknowledgement that beyond a certain point on the path, there was no turning back and no soft landing, and everyone in the room understood it and they went ahead. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make this sound like recklessness dressed up as vision. It was not. What is striking about the men who made this decision is how unromantic they were about it. Allen was a lawyer who liked contracts and detail and quiet. He had, 13 years earlier, spent about $16 million of Boeing's own money on a prototype jet transport that no customer had ordered, an aircraft known inside the company as the Dash 80, and that sum had been something like a quarter of everything the company was worth at the time. It had worked. Out of that prototype came the 707 and the military tanker fleet, and Boeing's entire position in commercial jets. So Allen had a personal, hard-earned data point that told him a well-chosen leap could remake a company. He also knew from the same experience exactly how close the edge was, and the other half of his reasoning was simpler and less inspiring, and it is the part that often gets left out. Boeing did not really believe in 1966 that the enormous new airplane was the future of passenger flying. Almost nobody did. The consensus in the industry, held sincerely by clever people, was that the future of long-distance travel belonged to supersonic aircraft. The British and French were building the Concorde. The Soviets were building their own. The American government was running a competition for a supersonic transport of its own, larger and faster than Concorde, and Boeing was in that competition and desperately wanted to win it, which they did at the very end of 1966, meaning that for several years the company was carrying two colossal programs simultaneously, one of them subsonic and enormous, the other supersonic and even more technically fearsome. So the logic that made the gamble survivable in the minds of Boeing's leadership was a hedge. If the supersonic age arrived on schedule and passengers deserted the big subsonic jet, the big subsonic jet would simply become the world's greatest freighter. That was the fallback, and it was taken seriously enough that it shaped the airplane's anatomy permanently. It is the reason the flight deck sits up in that hump above the main cabin, so that the entire nose could hinge upward and swallow cargo through the front. It is the reason the fuselage was made just wide enough to take two standard shipping containers side by side on the main deck. Every one of those choices was insurance against a future in which people flew faster and boxes flew slower. And the wonderful irony, which we will come to in time, is that the insurance policy turned out to be the main business. The supersonic future never arrived in any commercial sense, and the strange bulge that existed only to make room for a cargo door became the most recognizable silhouette in the history of flight. Which brings us to a question worth pausing on. If the leadership genuinely thought the passenger version might be a stopgap, why commit $1 billion and the entire company to it? And the answer, I think, is that they were not really betting on one airplane. They were betting on Tripp's 40-year argument. They were betting that ordinary people in enormous numbers were about to start flying, and that whatever shape the machinery took, whoever built the vehicle that carried the many rather than the few would own the next 30 years of the industry. It was not a bet on supersonic versus subsonic. It was a bet on abundance, and that bet, unlike almost every technical forecast of the era, was completely and spectacularly right. Let us go back to the airline for a moment, because the phrase we usually reach for is that Boeing bet the company, and that is true, but it is only half of the ledger. Pan American bet itself too, and this is a much less celebrated act of nerve. $525 million was an extraordinary commitment for an airline of that era. It was more than the carrier's own net worth, and the aircraft were only the beginning of the spending. What it did not have was anything else. No buildings, no roads to speak of, no level ground. Photographs from that first year look less like an aerospace program and more like an old logging operation. Trees down, stumps everywhere, mud in every direction, the deep, patient mud of the Pacific Northwest, which does not dry out because it rains again before it can. Crews worked through the winter in it. They moved millions of cubic yards of earth to flatten a hillside. They laid foundations while it rained on them, and then they raised the largest building in the world by volume, a structure so vast that when it was finished it enclosed something on the order of 200 million cubic feet of air, with doors big enough to swallow an office block and interior distances long enough that workers used bicycles to get from one end to the other. And here is the part that still seems slightly unreasonable to me every time I think about it. They were designing the airplane while they were building the building. Not before, during. Engineers in temporary offices, some of them working out of rented spaces and old facilities miles away, producing drawings for a machine whose assembly line was being poured in concrete at the same moment. Tooling was ordered for parts that had not been finalized. Jigs were built for a fuselage whose exact dimensions were still being argued over. The first sections of the first aircraft were assembled in a building that was still in places open to the weather, with plastic sheeting and portable heaters, and men in raincoats holding drawings that were wet at the edges. At its height, something like 50,000 people were working on the program. 50,000. That is a small city, all of it aimed at one object. And they were working under a set of nicknames that they gave themselves, half in pride and half in dark humor. Sutter's engineering group came to be called the Incredibles because that was the only word that fit what they were being asked to do. There is a story, and I think it is the single most human moment in the entire program, about a meeting in which senior management, watching the money burn, asked Sutter how many engineers he could cut from his team. Hundreds, they suggested. And Sutter said no. In fact, he said that he did not need fewer people. He needed several hundred more, and that if he did not get them, the airplane would not make its date. And everyone in the room knew what missing the date would cost under the terms of that contract. Consider what a strange, brave thing that was to say. He was a chief engineer being asked to help save the company money, and he answered by asking for more of it, on the grounds that the only way out of the situation was through it, at full speed, properly staffed. And consider the response, because Bill Allen, the careful lawyer with his notes about patience, listened and then approved the additional people. That is what the courage of this program actually looked like, not a speech, not a slogan, a man saying, "I need more help," and another man saying, "All right," and both of them going back to work. The money, of course, kept going out the door, and this is where the story acquires its particular tension, the kind that does not resolve for years. When the program was authorized, the planners believed development would cost somewhere near $1 billion. The reality, as with almost every ambitious engineering project in human history, ran higher. There was the factory, there were the new tools, most of them one-off machines built specifically for parts nobody had ever made before, some of them the largest of their type anywhere. There were the engines, which arrived heavy and troublesome and would need a great deal of expensive attention before they behaved. There were 5 test aircraft, all of them flying an enormous certification program, and every hour of it costing money. There was the ordinary friction of doing everything at once, in the rain, at speed. So Boeing borrowed, not from one bank, because no single bank was going to write that check, but from a syndicate of them, more than 20 institutions lining up together to lend against the future of a machine that had not yet proven it could earn $1. The total facility ran well past $1 billion, and at the time it was described as the largest sum ever borrowed by a private company, a genuinely unprecedented act of commercial faith. And the interest on that debt did not care about engineering elegance or historical significance. It came due on schedule every quarter, whether or not the engines were producing full thrust. You already know from the way this chapter opened that the story ends well. The airplane flew in February of 1969, and it flew beautifully. But I do not want to skip past the fact that between the contract and the payoff, there was a long stretch of time during which the outcome was genuinely unknown, and during which the people carrying the weight of it did not have the comfort of hindsight that we have. There were nights when very senior people at Boeing did not sleep. There were months when the company's share price sagged and analysts wrote the sort of columns that analysts write. And beyond the program's own troubles, the wider world was preparing to turn against them, because at the exact moment the aircraft entered service, the airline industry slid into a recession, orders evaporated, the supersonic program was canceled by Congress, and Boeing's employment collapsed from something near 140,000 people to a fraction of that inside a few years. In the Seattle area, it was severe enough that people put up a billboard about the last one out, turning off the lights. All of that is ahead in our story, and we will walk through it slowly and gently when we get there, because it has a good ending too. But it matters here in the chapter about the gamble, because it tells you what kind of gamble it truly was. It was not a bet that paid off immediately and cleanly. It was a bet that came due in the worst possible market and survived, and then paid off for 50 years afterward. More than 1,500 of these aircraft would eventually be built. The last one rolled out of that same factory in Everett, on that same patch of former forest, in early 2023, 56 years after the ground was cleared. There are not many decisions made in a fishing boat that stay in production for over half a century, and I think what makes this part of the story restful rather than stressful, if you let it be, is the character of the people involved. There is no villain here. There is no dramatic ultimatum, no shouting, no crisis of ego. There is a formal, reserved lawyer who wrote himself reminders to stay calm. There is an aging airline founder with a lifelong conviction that flying should be for everybody, spending his last professional years making sure of it. There is an engineer who told the truth about what he needed. There is a turban man from Detroit who was handed the impossible and quietly went and did it in the mud. And there are 50,000 people, machinists and draftsmen and crane operators and typists and metallurgists and secretaries, most of whose names have vanished entirely, who came to work every day in the rain and made something enormous out of paper and aluminium and stubbornness. That is what a leap of faith actually looks like when you get close to it. Not a leap at all, really. More like a very long walk taken by a great many people in bad weather toward a destination they could only partly see. Faith, in this context, was not a feeling. It was a schedule. It was showing up. It was ordering the steel before you were certain of the dimensions, and pouring the floor before you knew exactly what would sit on it, and trusting that the person in the next building was doing their part as carefully as you were doing yours. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that ought to make you feel warm rather than anxious as you listen, is that the trust was justified. All of it. Every link in that chain held. There is one more image I would like to leave you with before we move on. When the contract was signed in the spring of 1966, and the news went out that Pan American had ordered 25 aircraft of a type that did not yet exist, the reaction across the industry was not universal enthusiasm. Some airlines thought the aircraft was far too large and would fly around half empty. Some airports quietly hoped it would be delayed long enough for them to prepare. Some competitors decided to build smaller wide bodies instead, which is where the other great three-engine jets of the era came from, and those were fine aircraft too. But within a couple of years, 26 airlines had put their names down, and on roll-out day their flight attendants stood together under that vast nose in their different uniforms, and you can see in the photographs that they are all doing the same thing, which is looking up. That is the whole gamble made visible. A group of people standing in the shadow of something that existed only because a few individuals decided, without proof, that it should. Everything about it had been uncertain. The money was borrowed, the factory was new,